Emma grabbed her keys and her overnight bag, kissed the baby's forehead one last time, and walked out to the driveway just like she'd told Marcus she would. Her sister's place, 3 days, some space to think after the fight they'd had that morning. It hadn't even been a big fight, not really, just one of those small, grinding arguments about money and schedules and who'd forgotten to call the pediatrician back, the kind of fight that isn't really about what it's about. But something in it had cracked open a tiredness in her that had been building for months, and when she'd said, half out of frustration, that maybe she needed a few days away, Marcus hadn't argued. He'd just nodded, quiet in a way that unsettled her more than if he'd fought back. She backed out slowly, watching him wave from the doorway with the baby monitor clipped to his belt, one hand lifted in a gesture that looked almost rehearsed. She told herself she was imagining things. 8 years of marriage did strange things to your read on a person. Sometimes you knew them so well you could hear the silence underneath their words, and sometimes that same familiarity made you doubt every instinct you had, second-guessing yourself into believing nothing was wrong when something clearly was. She drove exactly 2 blocks before pulling over and parking behind the old Miller house, the one that had sat empty for years with its overgrown hedges and peeling shutters, far enough from her own street that Marcus wouldn't spot her car if he happened to glance out a window. She cut the engine and sat there in the sudden quiet, hands still on the wheel, feeling faintly ridiculous. "What are you doing?" she asked herself. "Spying on your own husband, like some jealous stranger." But she didn't start the car again. She sat there for 10 full minutes, watching the shadows shift across the Miller house's dead lawn, telling herself she was being paranoid, that this was exactly the kind of small-minded suspicion that ruined good marriages, that Marcus had never given her a real reason to doubt him in 8 years together. He forgot anniversaries sometimes. He left dishes in the sink. He wasn't perfect. But he wasn't the kind of man who lied, or so she'd always believed, and believing it had always been easy, because she'd never had reason to test it. And yet, there had been things lately. Small things she'd noticed, and then talked herself out of noticing. Phone calls he stepped outside to take. A credit card statement with a charge she didn't recognize that he'd brushed off as work stuff before changing the subject. The way he'd been oddly cheerful the last 2 weeks despite the stress of the new baby, despite the sleepless nights, despite everything that should have worn him down the way it had worn her down. She'd told herself it was nothing. She'd told herself a lot of things lately. She pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the app icon that synced to the baby monitor in the nursery, the one Marcus had insisted on installing after the baby was born, the one with the camera that let them check in from anywhere in the house, or, apparently, from 2 blocks away in a parked car outside an abandoned property. Just to see the baby, she told herself. That's all. I just want to see her. She pressed play on the live feed. The picture loaded slowly, buffering in that grainy, greenish way the app always did indoors, the low nursery light giving everything a strange, underwater quality. She could make out the crib, the mobile turning slowly overhead, the outline of the changing table against the far wall. No baby crying, no movement in the frame. Good. She'd left her with Marcus for the afternoon before her own drive. The baby would be down for her nap by now. Marcus wasn't in the room, though. She could hear him, his voice drifting in from somewhere just outside the nursery, maybe the hallway, low and urgent in a way that made the hair on her arms stand up before she'd even processed the words. "She's finally gone," he was saying. 3 days. That's plenty of time. Emma's hand tightened around the phone so hard her knuckles went pale. Her stomach dropped in a slow, sickening way, like a car cresting a hill too fast. She held her breath, straining to catch every word through the tinny, imperfect audio of the app. There was a pause, long enough that she wondered if she'd imagined the whole thing, if her tired, suspicious mind had conjured a sentence out of static, and then a woman's voice answered him, muffled, distant, but unmistakably close by, unmistakably real. "Are you sure she bought it?" The question landed in Emma's chest like something physical. She sat very still, phone gripped in both hands now, staring at the grainy nursery on her screen as though she might see through the wall into whatever room they were actually standing in. "She always does," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice Emma had never once heard in 8 years of marriage, something light, almost giddy, a kind of boyish excitement that used to belong to her, that she used to be the one who put there. Hearing it aimed at someone else felt like watching a stranger wearing her husband's face. "Come on," he continued. "Let's get everything set up before she changes her mind and comes back early." Set up. The words rattled around in Emma's skull, refusing to settle into any shape that made sense.
Set up what?
Set up who? She thought of every worst possibility in the space of half a second. Thought of Renee's name rising unbidden in her mind, though she couldn't say why. Thought of the strange charges on the credit card. Thought of every late night and every closed-door phone call from the last 2 months. All of it rearranging itself into a single, ugly picture she didn't want to look at, but couldn't look away from either. She should go back. Every instinct in her body was screaming at her to turn the key, floor at the 2 blocks home, and catch them, whoever them was, in whatever they were doing before either of them had time to hide it, to lie, to construct some story sturdy enough to survive her walking through the door. Her hand actually moved to the ignition, but she stopped. If she went back right now, she'd get denials. She'd get a scramble of excuses thrown together in the panicked seconds between his phone buzzing with the sound of her car pulling into the driveway and her actual footsteps hitting the porch. She knew Marcus. He was quick and he was good with words when he needed to be, and if she gave him even 30 seconds of warning, he would find some way to make whatever this was sound smaller than it was, or different than it was, or not what it looked like at all. She needed more than a feeling. She needed to actually see. So instead of starting the engine, she sat back against the seat, phone held close, and kept the feed open, watching with her heart hammering against her ribs as the picture on the screen shifted, the camera itself moving, tilting, some unseen hand adjusting it, and she realized, with a strange lurch of understanding, that Marcus must have carried the little camera unit right out of the nursery altogether, into some other room of the house. She sat frozen in her car outside the old Miller house, engine off, phone screen glowing pale against her face in the dimming afternoon light, listening to her husband's voice move through their home like he'd been waiting, quietly, for this exact moment to arrive. She almost drove home right then. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to turn the key, floor it back to the house, and catch them in whatever they were doing before they could hide it. Her hand actually closed around the ignition, knuckles white, ready to twist it, ready to have this over with one way or another. But something colder and more patient took over instead, the same instinct that had made her check the monitor in the first place instead of just driving off toward her sisters, without a second thought. If she went back now, she'd get denials. Excuses. Some story stitched together in the 30 seconds it took her to walk from the driveway to the front door. Marcus was quick on his feet when he needed to be. It was one of the things she'd always loved about him, the way he could talk his way into or out of almost anything, and right now that felt less like a charming trait and more like a threat. She needed more than a feeling. She needed to actually see whatever was happening in her house before he had any chance to reshape it into something else. So she stayed where she was, engine off, seat leaned back just enough to keep her out of sight of anyone glancing down the street, phone held so close to her face she could feel the faint warmth of the screen against her skin. She kept the feed open and watched the picture shift and jostle as Marcus carried the monitor's camera unit. She realized now, with a strange lurch, that he must have detached it from its little stand in the nursery, down the hallway. She caught fragmented glimpses as he walked. A strip of ceiling, the top of a doorframe, the corner of a framed photo from their wedding that hung crooked no matter how many times she straightened it. Then the picture steadied as he set the camera down on the bookshelf in the living room, angled toward the couch, and Emma understood, with a small jolt, that he had no idea he was still broadcasting any of this straight to his wife's phone. He'd forgotten. Or maybe, she thought, watching the empty living room settle into frame, he simply hadn't thought about it at all, too consumed with whatever he was doing to remember that the device clipped to his belt an hour ago had a second life, as a live camera feed synced to an app neither of them ever really thought about once the baby had gotten old enough to sleep through most nights. Emma's pulse hadn't slowed at all. If anything, the waiting made it worse. Every second of empty living room on her screen was a second for her imagination to fill in whatever it wanted, and it wanted, insistently, to fill it in with the worst version of this story. She thought of Renee again, unbidden, and hated herself a little for how quickly the name had surfaced, how readily her mind reached for the most familiar shape of betrayal instead of anything else. Then a woman came into frame carrying 2 large duffel bags, and Emma's breath caught so hard it hurt. It was Renee, Marcus's coworker. The one from the holiday party 2 years ago, the one who'd laughed a beat too long at his jokes while Emma stood by the drink table making small talk with someone else's spouse and pretending not to notice. She remembered mentioning it to Marcus in the car on the way home that night, half joking, and remembered how he'd rolled his eyes and said, "That's just Renee. She's like that with everyone." And how easily she'd let it go, because 8 years of trust doesn't unravel over one long laugh at a party. Now here was Renee, in her own living room, carrying duffel bags like she was moving in, and every one of Emma's old, dismissed suspicions came rushing back at once, hot and vindicated and sick all at the same time. "Where do you want the boxes?" Renee asked, setting the bags down near the couch, and Emma blinked at the screen, thrown by the sentence, because it wasn't remotely what she'd braced herself to hear. Boxes. Not what she'd expected a woman to say, while sneaking into another woman's house to see her husband. "Garage for now," Marcus said, his voice coming from somewhere off camera, easy and unbothered in a way that made no sense against the panic climbing Emma's throat. "We'll sort it out this weekend before the delivery guys get here." Emma sat up straighter in the driver's seat, frowning hard at the little glowing rectangle in her hands. Boxes. Delivery guys. None of it lined up with the picture she'd already built to her head, and the mismatch was its own kind of disorienting, like missing a stair in the dark. She kept watching, barely breathing, as Marcus stepped into frame at last, crossing to the coffee table with a large rolled-up sheet of paper under one arm. He unrolled it flat across the table, smoothing the curling edges down with both palms, and Renee leaned in beside him, their heads bent close together over whatever it was, her ponytail nearly brushing his shoulder. For one awful second the old, ugly reading of the scene reasserted itself in Emma's mind, and she had to remind herself, deliberately, to actually watch instead of assume. "She's going to lose it when she sees this," Renee said, and laughed, not the careful, secretive laugh of someone doing something they shouldn't, but a bright, delighted one, easy and unguarded, the kind of laugh you didn't bother hiding. "That's the whole point," Marcus said, and there was a smile in his voice that Emma recognized after all, one she hadn't heard aimed her way often enough lately, but that she'd know anywhere, the smile from their wedding day, from the night they brought the baby home, from 100 small good moments buried under the exhaustion of the last year. 8 years next month. "She thinks I forgot." The words didn't make sense at first. Emma actually rewound the last few seconds in her head, replaying them, waiting for them to click into the shape of betrayal she'd already built for them. They wouldn't click. They kept insisting on meaning something else entirely. "Renee's brother does the landscaping crew," Marcus went on, angling the paper slightly so the camera, unknowingly, uselessly to him, but very usefully to the woman parked 2 blocks away with tears already gathering hot and unexpected in her eyes, caught more of it. "He agreed to get it done in 3 days if we pay for the rush. That's why I needed her actually gone, not just at work for the afternoon. I've been planning this for 2 months. Emma stared at the screen, and slowly, the picture on the coffee table resolved into something recognizable, a blueprint, hand-drawn in blue ink, unmistakably their backyard, the same patchy grass and sagging fence she stared at every morning through the kitchen window while she nursed the baby and waited for the coffee to finish. Except transformed. There was a pergola sketched in over what was currently just a stretch of dead grass. A winding little garden path. And tucked into the corner by the back fence, in the exact spot she'd once mentioned, offhand, months ago, half asleep and cradling a newborn at 2 in the morning, that she'd always dreamed of having a small quiet space that belonged only to her, a reading nook, a bench, a single sketched-in tree for shade. She'd said it once. One tired, rambling sentence in the dark, and she hadn't thought he'd even been fully awake to hear it, let alone remember it 2 months later. "He's not going to be able to do the pergola in 3 days, Renee was saying, tapping a finger against the paper, but the bones of it, sure. Bench, path, the tree, that's doable. That's fine, Marcus said. I just want enough done that she gets the idea. We can finish the rest together, slower, once she's back and I don't have to hide it from her every night. Renee laughed again, shaking her head. You've been so weird the last 2 weeks. Sneaking off to call the landscaper in the bathroom like a teenager. You know, Marcus said. You caught me twice. I caught you 3 times, Renee corrected. You're just bad at this. Emma sat in her car outside the old Miller house, hand pressed flat against her chest as though she could physically hold her heart in place, and let out a sound that came out half laugh, half sob, watching her husband lean over a hand-drawn blueprint of a backyard that didn't exist yet, built entirely out of one exhausted, half-asleep sentence she barely remembered saying. All those charges on the credit card, the phone calls he'd stepped outside to take, the strange, private cheerfulness she'd mistaken, in her most tired and frightened moments, for something ugly. She thought of the fight that morning, the one that had sent her out the door with an overnight bag and a head full of doubts, and understood now that Marcus had probably let her go without much of a fight, not because he didn't care, but because her leaving had solved a logistical problem he'd been quietly wrestling with for 2 months. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, laughing again, shakier this time, relief and shame and something achingly tender all tangled together in her chest. She thought about calling her sister and telling her she wasn't coming after all. She thought about walking back into the house right now and telling Marcus everything, the monitor, the 2 blocks, the entire ridiculous, humiliating, wonderful truth of what she'd just watched. Instead, she sat there a while longer, watching her husband and his coworker argue cheerfully over rush delivery fees for mulch, and let herself simply feel the specific, disorienting joy of being wrong about the worst thing she'd ever suspected of him.